Okay, so welcome everyone officially to Plagiarism, Teaching Strategies and Resources. I am so happy to have you all here today. For anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Jane Hammonds. I'm an assistant professor in the university libraries. I'm the Teaching and Learning Engagement Librarian, and you can contact me at hammonds.73 at osu.edu. I'm always happy to talk more about this stuff. So please go ahead and send me an email if you do have any questions, comments afterwards. And I also put a little disclaimer on here. I just wanted to mention I am going to be sharing some resources that were developed by the Ohio State's Committee on Academic Misconduct, or COAM. But I'm giving this presentation not as an official representative of COAM. So I wanted to make sure that that is clear. I'm not a member of the COAM committee. And we're going to be talking about some issues where I would like to open up a discussion about how we approach and think about teaching plagiarism. And I just want to make it clear that I'm not in any way putting this out as sort of official policy, except for when I indicate that it is clearly COAM policy. But in other cases, it's more just going to be my opinion. So, please don't go running to COAM and say that I told them that, I told you that you don't have to follow their policy. That is not the case. So I just wanted to put that out there before we jump in case there was any confusion on that one. So what we're going to be talking about today is we're going to just really quickly talk a little bit about definitions and forms of plagiarism. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but we are going to think about some approaches to teaching about plagiarism and thinking about plagiarism. I'm going to talk about some of the reasons why students might plagiarism. So what are the bottlenecks or the issues that might lead a student to plagiarize? And then we'll think again about some teaching strategies and resources to help students understand more about what plagiarism is and how they can make sure to avoid plagiarism. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. Okay, Kitty, sorry about that. I will make sure to change that access. Everyone should be able to, there is an open access link, so I'll make sure to change that. Thank you. All right, so really quickly, definitions of plagiarism. So this is the definition of plagiarism provided by Ohio State's Committee on Academic Misconduct. So plagiarism as the representation of another's, oops, sorry, I'm too fast there. Another's work or ideals as one own, including unacknowledged word-for-word use, paraphrasing, or the inappropriate, unacknowledged use of another person's ideas. So that is from the student conduct rule, the definition of plagiarism. So keeping that definition in mind, what I'd like to know is, based on your own experience, what does plagiarism look like in practice? So what are the common forms of plagiarism that you've encountered in your work with students, whether that's as an instructor, as a librarian, in whatever role that you might be in? And I'll ask you to share your responses using a Jamboard. And I'll put the link to that in the chat one more time. So that should be that second link there should take you out to the Jamboard, and everyone should have access to that. So I'm going to try to go out to that myself. So if you have not used the Jamboard before, hopefully everyone should now be seeing the Jamboard. If not, just let me know. If you haven't used the Jamboard before, I think the easiest way to post your response is to go over on the left-hand side, click Sticky Note, and that will allow you to type your response there and post that into the Jamboard. So again, we're thinking about, keeping that definition of plagiarism in mind that I shared. What does plagiarism look like in practice in terms of the forms or the types of plagiarism that you have encountered? Right, so we're definitely seeing some responses in here. A few folks have mentioned copy and paste, right? So copying and pasting large amounts of text into a paper. Yep, cut and paste from a website, from a blog, right? From other types of sources. Yes, absolutely. Sticking too close to the original text when paraphrasing. Yes, and there's another one that just popped up, finding synonyms to change one or two words. So yeah, that paraphrasing and just, making a few minor changes rather than actually rewriting something in your own words. Yeah. Again, another one, don't know how to paraphrase. Yeah, I think paraphrasing plagiarism is a pretty common form. Someone wrote lack of in-text citation. So thinking a reference list is sufficient. Yeah, so students may say, I cited my sources, but not actually, provide that indication in the text of where they are citing. Someone also mentioned, not including quotation marks. Someone I saw their note go in that plagiarism can be accidental. Yes, that is absolutely the case. Plagiarism can often be accidental. Right. Images not attributed. That's a really good one, right? Students may think that plagiarism only counts in terms of if you're copying someone's words and not, recognizing in terms of images. Absolutely. So again, yeah, paraphrasing, self-plagiarism. Yes, that's a good one to mention as well. Synonyms. So I think, yeah, we're seeing a lot of different, there's the copy paste version of plagiarism. There's the paraphrasing version of plagiarism where students think that they're making enough changes, but they're really not. Self-plagiarism, including a citation list, but not including the in-text citation. So not recognizing, all aspects of citing those sources. Great. Yeah, so thank you all for sharing your responses there. We're going to go ahead and go back to our presentation. Having someone else write it for you. Yes, that's a good one as well. So we'll go ahead and back to our current slide. So some of the forms of plagiarism that are highlighted by the Committee on Academic Misconduct, they have a plagiarism worksheet where they describe several different forms of plagiarism. And as someone mentioned, having someone else write it for you, that would be a great example of complete plagiarism. So submitting someone else's work, whether it's a friend, you've paid someone to write it. I would also put in here, this is not officially part of the COAM policy system, doesn't specifically mention AI, but if you had ChatGPT write a paper for you, I think that would fit into that as well. So that complete plagiarism form, cut and paste kind of plagiarism, the copying, so directly copying, large chunks of text or quotation marks, right, into the source. And then, as we already mentioned, the paraphrasing plagiarism, we know that can be definitely a really tricky, that's a really hard skill, I think, paraphrasing is. So that one can definitely be tricky. Someone had mentioned self-plagiarism. And this, for me, at least in my interactions with students, in my discussion with students, is the one that I found that students sometimes find the hardest to understand because they don't understand why this would be a problem. And I know at least some conversations that I've had with some of the folks from COAM that this is one that you do see at Ohio State. And on that note, I will mention that some of the slides in this presentation are ones that I have given in previous presentations. So I wanted to make that acknowledgement clear as well. And then misinterpretation of common knowledge, right? So what is considered common knowledge? Because I'm not going to cite this because everyone knows this. And, not recognizing that that's not always going to be the case. So those are just some of the different forms of plagiarism that I want to highlight. And obviously it can take even more specific forms going forward. One that's not really mentioned here very specifically, but I know there's one that comes up is copying computer code. Students not recognizing that is also a form of plagiarism. So I wanted to just highlight and get an idea, a picture of sort of what forms of plagiarism folks are seeing, what that looks like, sort of in practice. So I'll pause there before I move forward just to see if anyone has any comments or questions, if there's any other form of plagiarism that you've seen that you would like to highlight really quickly, or just any questions about any of those forms or definitions. Okay. So if anything does pop up, you can feel free to put things in the chat as we're going forward. But I wanted to take a second to think about our approaches to teaching plagiarism. And this is the part, again, where I'm speaking for myself in this part and when thinking about how we approach teaching plagiarism. So Louise shared confusion for students when they have teachers who actually expect word for word responses and things like definitions that have been provided. Yes, I think that's a really good point. Louise, and that's a great example of the kind of confusion that comes around this, that instructors sometimes have different expectations, where some may want an exact word for word like definition of something. Absolutely. So Kate shared, should these be addressed by the students honor code? I don't know if there's something specific that you're looking at there, Kate, or I mean, there is the plagiarism, academic integrity is addressed in Ohio State student conduct code for sure. But if there's something more specific that you were looking for there, Kate, just to go ahead and let me know. So thinking about plagiarism teaching approaches, I'd like to start this section with just like a little scenario. So, a student writes a paper for a sociology course, and the paper includes information taken directly from the slides that her instructor provides in class, but does not provide a citation for that information. Instructor considers this to be plagiarism and reports the student to COAM. So I'd like to have you all just take a minute to think about that situation. And if you feel comfortable, only if you feel comfortable, would like to share whether or not you consider that to be plagiarism, what your response to that scenario might be. And again, I do understand that some folks might not feel comfortable to sharing their reaction to that, but if anyone is, we'll give everyone a chance to just to think about that and see. So Maria shared, yes, I think it's plagiarism. I give my students the how to cite class slides information to support that notion. Yes. And Tanya shared, it may technically be plagiarism, but it seems like it was a lost learning opportunity. The teacher might have talked to the student first before reporting them. And I think that those responses are really great. Kate shared, as the instructor, I provide information on how to cite my slides. Yes, I think those are great points that both Kate and Maria, I think, shared, like how important it is for instructors to make their expectations clear. I think this is an example of a scenario where I feel it's understandable that a student might not recognize that what their teacher, that they have to cite what their teacher is telling them. So this is one of the sort of more understandable from my perspectives, like I can see why a student would be really confused here. But I think as several folks mentioned, this is a great place where an instructor can really make their goals or their intentions really clear here, making sure that students know that they do have to cite your notes or your PowerPoint presentation and give them guidance on how to do that, so that expectation is clear there. And yeah, Jared brought up the point. Yeah, is this commonly known information? Yeah, so that also raises that that issue that we already saw of what's common knowledge, what's not common knowledge. So Louise shared, I think this falls into the category for the student of my own knowledge, but I tell students how to cite information learned in Dr. Collins' class. And yeah, yes. Purdue also shows, Dia shared, Purdue also shows how to reference lecture presentations as well. Yeah, so great. So thank you all for sharing your response to that scenario. And yeah, I agree that, I think that this is a place where a learning opportunity for students is really important. So giving them those clear expectations that, yes, I do expect you to cite my slides or my, my presentation that I'm giving, and making sure that they're clear how to do that. Great. So I also wanted to get your reaction to a statement. This came from a presentation that a couple of librarians gave at the Association of College and Research Libraries conference a couple of years ago. And they gave a really great presentation on called Under Pressure about approaches to plagiarism. And one of their statements was that traditional anti-plagiarism measures are punitive, harmful, and widespread. So I'd love to hear if anyone has any thoughts in response to that question. Agreement, disagreement, uncertainty, any of those. Again, feel comfortable sharing. I will give everyone a chance to think about that. Jared gives a thumbs up. Yes. And I'll talk a little bit more in a second about what this means from my perspective. But just wanted to give everyone a chance to respond. So Louise disagrees, complete lack of respect for the author who created the work. And then we have an agreement. Many times it happens due to poor time management and disorganization. So again, another learning opportunity. Also agreed, there's no room in traditional methods to teach students how to actually create work with integrity. Another comment, I think plagiarism is serious and needs to have consequences, but there should be consideration for whether the student was knowingly plagiarizing or not. Also general agreement, plagiarism is a difficult concept for some students. They may not have all had the opportunity to learn what it is or how to avoid it. These are teachable moments, Kate shared, rather than those that require punishment, need remediation. Yeah, so thank you all. We've got some great comments and thoughts going in here in terms of, thinking about how we approach teaching plagiarism. Do we come from this sort of teachable moment perspective? Or, does doing that, is there disrespect to the original author or the original creator? If we don't take the approach of that a student should be punished for plagiarism, and the comments in there about how much students actually know, do they all come from a situation in which they've had the opportunity to really learn and understand all of the intricacies of plagiarism? So yeah, thank you. There's great discussion and debate going in the responses there. So one of the things that I wanted to highlight in thinking about this is this idea and what that the Hill and Tadina talked about, the two librarians talked about. Really, there's a lot of emphasis on compliance, but without really always providing a context for understanding why citations are considered so important. So I think that's kind of been represented in the comments that we've seen from folks about a teachable moment. And maybe there's been too much emphasis on having perfect citation format rather than thinking about this as a learning opportunity, as thinking about, did the students really learn something from doing this assignment, or is the only thing important whether or not that they got the perfect citation format in there? And one of the things that you see a lot is plagiarism is often described and represented as a crime, right? I put a couple of example quotes in there. One's from the Purdue Owl, which someone mentioned, that references plagiarism as a crime. And I was looking on Adobe stock, and these are a few images that were licensed from Adobe stock that kind of represent this theme of plagiarists are criminals. They're running away and they're striped convict shirts. Right. So if you search plagiarism in Adobe stock, these are the kinds of images that come up that have this real sort of criminal element to it. And, I've always had some concerns around this idea of representing plagiarism as a crime. In most cases, technically, plagiarism is not a crime. It's generally not illegal to plagiarize. Copyright infringement is a crime. And there may be some cases in which plagiarism could be considered a crime, but in most cases, it's technically not a crime, right? It's an ethical violation. But beyond that, right, when we have this very punitive, crime-focused approach to plagiarism, that puts students in the role of criminals or prospective criminals, right? And that puts instructors in the role of the plagiarism police. And thinking about what that does to our classroom environments when we take that approach. I put a quote on here from an article was published more than 10 years ago now in the Chronicle about plagiarism, that either you can be a teacher or you can be the plagiarism police, and kind of setting that dichotomy there in terms of how we approach and think about plagiarism. So I've always had some concerns with this approach that thinking about and looking at plagiarism from this criminal perspective. The other thing that I wanted to mention is this idea of plagiarism anxiety. If you do like a Google search, you'll find students talking about plagiarism and sharing their fears. Like, I'm so afraid that I'm going to get caught for, not that they had actually plagiarized or, had deliberately set out to do it, but it's just sort of a worry that was out there. I think I did everything right, but I'm still so worried about getting caught for plagiarism. So it creates this real, situation of anxiety, tension and whether or not that creates the best sort of learning environment. So I wanted to raise this just as again a way to think about our general approaches to teaching plagiarism, and whether we approach it as a teachable moment or not. And again, I don't want to say that I am encouraging anyone to violate the academic integrity policy in terms of when it's necessary to report plagiarism, but I did just want to kind of raise some of these issues and questions before we go on. So I'll pause there to see if anyone has any additional thoughts or comments that they would like to share around this idea of the sort of punitive approach to plagiarism, alternatives to that folks might be able to think about. Kate shared, I also have a problem with students listing resources in their bibliography or works cited that they themselves did not consult or use. Yes, because obviously, part of academic integrity is making sure that you're not misrepresenting what someone else says. And so if you don't actually consult the source yourself, if you don't actually read the source yourself, how do you know that the person that you're trusting actually got it right? Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. So Brad shared, losing 1/3 of a letter grade plus a 0 on the assignment seems harsh. I think the 0 on the assignment is sufficient. Yeah, that's a great point, Brad, and raising and thinking about sort of the levels of punishment, and are particular forms of punishment always equal to the offense that was caused. Especially as we've had a few folks talk about, especially if students truly did not know that what they were doing was wrong. I was questioned for plagiarism as a doctoral student. My advisor was called and ultimately the issue was deemed that there was unreasonable expectation by the author. This made me super paranoid about plagiarism for the past 25 years. That's such a great example. I was accused of plagiarism when I was in the 8th grade, and it's still think about that and remember that situation. And like when I turn in an article, I worry about that constantly. So it really does create that anxiety feeling. Absolutely. So Kate shared, include plagiarism guidelines in your rubrics for the class assignment. Yes, absolutely. We're going to talk more, Kate, about making sure that your expectations are very clear for students. Yeah, I think that's a really key strategy. Lori shared, I almost self-plagiarized in graduate school because I didn't know it was not allowed. And I've been paranoid ever since. Yep. Also, agreement with Kate's point about citing sources that they didn't actually review themselves. Yes. When you chase down the cited source, the paper doesn't say what the current authors claim. Yes. So yeah, you can't just say that, oh, well, someone else said that they said this, so I'm going to say this. Maria shared, I have an assignment in every class that requires students to go through the IU certification. And thank you for sharing the link for that, Maria. Folks want to take a look at that. And I'll mention really quickly, it's not done yet, and I don't know exactly when it is going to be done, but I am working with a group of folks from COAM that is putting together a Canvas module that should be available to all Ohio State students on plagiarism. So the hope is to have that ready by the fall, but no guarantees. So, but it is in the works. So I will let everyone know that now. All right, so I wanted to take a little bit of time before we get to the activities and resources, just to think about some of the reasons why students might plagiarize. And I know that we've already started to get to some of these, but thinking beyond, we know that some students, it may just be because, I don't care about this assignment. I'm just going to go out and find one and copy it. But there are a lot of cases where, students either genuinely don't know what they are doing wrong, or, there are certain circumstances going on in their life that lead them to an action that maybe they normally would not have taken. So I just wanted to highlight a few of these learning bottlenecks, because for me, I think that one of the things to taking sort of a less punitive approach to plagiarism is this idea of trying to understand a little bit more why this might be so challenging for students. We all have a lot of experience in higher education. We've been undergraduates, we've been graduate students. Many of us are instructors now, or we're librarians. And we still, as you've seen in the comments, we still have anxiety about plagiarism. So I think it's even more understandable that more novice learners who are put in this situation where there's a lot of very complicated, rules, might, have a lot of anxiety and concern about this and might be confused. So I'll just highlight a few. And as I mentioned already, when we think about this topic, it's not always easy to determine. There's a lot of different definitions of plagiarism out there. There's a lot of different examples of plagiarism out there. This is just a visual I took. It's from a blog post called the Visual Communication Guide, and the full citation is in the links there, or in the references. But this was one that I found, and just like thinking about this, like I think there's like 13 different sort of levels of plagiarism here, and you can see all of the different lines going through. So it's not always as easy to recognize if we plagiarized and if we did not. And especially as I mentioned, for a novice learner coming in, especially someone who is from a background, that maybe they didn't have a chance to learn much about plagiarism, as a high school student, coming in and finding all of these rules and finding things that you sort of would do in your everyday life, or when you just repeat what someone else says, or you post something that someone else says, that those are plagiarism. You might not always recognize that. And someone mentioned self-plagiarism as one of those things that maybe not be obvious to someone who is just coming into higher education. So I do think the complexity of plagiarism is one of the reasons why we see some of these issues coming forward. So I'd like to hear if folks have thoughts about any misconceptions that students might have. And I think we won't do the Jamboard this time in the interest of time, because we already kind of talked about these. But if anyone wanted to share any sort of misconceptions that students have about what they should or should not do, and any ones that perhaps that we haven't talked about so far. That it's no big deal. Yes, that's a great one, Brad. Hey, everyone copies everything all the time, right? That's the environment that we live in. And so we're always copying and sharing and remixing things. And it's, it's not really that important. Mm-hmm. Just changing the words or tense without attribution. Yes, absolutely. I think the paraphrasing is one of the, and what constitutes paraphrasing, appropriate paraphrasing and non-appropriate paraphrasing is a real challenge for students. Some of the other ones, right? The idea, I think we've already touched on this, that it's only plagiarism if you copy someone's words, right? So rather than that, plagiarism also accounts, if you take images, graphs, charts, those kinds of things, that plagiarism doesn't count if you're giving a presentation. It could be one that students might have. It's not a thing in my country. Yes, that's a good point. I'm gonna bring that up in just a second, Louise. Sort of cultural differences about what plagiarism is. Yes, Krista, just putting links to sources that they used in the works cited list is citing. Yes, right. So the difference is between, here's the link versus here's the actual full citation. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great. So a few other sort of reasons in terms of thinking about why students might plagiarize. So I already mentioned this part a little bit, but our students have grown up in an online environment where everything is digital. Hello, Lucky. Sorry, my cat had joined. Everything seems to be available for free. And so, this article from Dyer, they have this argument that students may be developing a fundamentally different understanding of plagiarism, right? A very different value in terms of what intellectual property is, those kinds of things. And so a student that has grown up in this environment where sharing and remixing and reusing things is done all the time, again, may have that perspective that it's not really a big deal, or, this is the way things are, in this sort of digital society that we live in. Another thing I want to mention is all of the disciplinary differences around plagiarism and citation. So students not recognizing when they need to use a different citation form, Each different disciplines have different sort of conventions in terms of how sources are integrated into a paper or project, that students may not always recognize all of these differences. One of the things I'll mention, my colleague Danny Dotson talks about a lot. If a student goes to a journal article, like they find it in a database or they find it on a website, often they'll be given guidance. Here's how to cite this source, and they'll copy that and put that in there and not realize that it's not in the citation style that they're supposed to be using for their paper, because it doesn't really clarify what citation style they're actually using, or they don't realize they need to change the style that's provided. So that can be confusing as well for students. So we had a comment here. I know you mentioned self-plagiarism a few times, but many students and scholars do not really know what this term means. I am a journal editor for several years, and I see it often in my publisher gets all the time from across the globe. Yes, I completely agree with that. I think self-plagiarism is definitely one of the more misunderstood components of plagiarism. Yes, the relationship between copyright and plagiarism, that's a really important one too, Kate, right? That there is a distinction between copyright infringement and plagiarism, that they are not the same thing. So I think Louise, I think you mentioned, it's not plagiarism in my country. And I think it's important to recognize that there are, different, the understandings of plagiarism, academic integrity, intellectual property that are common in the United States or Western, culture more broadly are not universal, right? And there are, students coming from cultures where plagiarism is considered and thought of very differently, where, copying someone else's work is shown as to be a sign of respect, right, to someone, or, they may be discouraged from really producing and sharing their own thoughts or ideas. So having that recognition that not all of our students are going to come in with that same understanding of what plagiarism is. And that, I think that also goes to just more broadly, the fact that, when students enter into higher education, they're entering into a culture that has a lot of expectations and shared assumptions and shared values. And students from certain backgrounds or certain cultures are going to be less familiar with what those expectations and rules are. But because they've become so familiar and so understood to, more experienced researchers, it creates that sort of expert novice gap. And it can be really difficult to put ourselves in the perspective of someone who is just starting out and thinking, well, of course, everyone should know that you don't cut and paste, right? And, so just, keeping that in mind that, academic culture, the rules, the organization, it can be kind of impenetrable to someone from certain backgrounds, unless, again, they are given that clear understanding of what those expectations are. And one core concept that I want to mention and highlight as one, this is from the Framework for Information Literacy. A lot of our expectations for students when they do research or inquiry-based assignments are based around this idea of scholarship as a conversation. So recognizing that, scholars are all sort of collaboratively working together, they're sharing each other's work, they're arguing with each other, they're debating each other, rejecting each other's findings. This idea that this sort of ongoing scholarly conversation is one that drives a lot of our expectations and, is really closely related to why we think citation is so important, because we recognize the importance to the scholarly conversation of having accurate citations. But a student that does not have a conception of this sort of idea of scholarship as this conversation, again, may be missing a key understanding that really helps them to see why citation is so important. Okay. So I see a couple comments coming in there. Okay, great. Sorry, Dean. Yeah, I will share everything with everyone. So we have Lori sharing about sort of incomplete understanding of self-citation or self-plagiarism. Don't turn in the same work for 2 different classes as a don't, but could do this instead. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's a great point, right? That, self-plagiarism can be really complicated to understand. And I can take a look and definitely see if I have a really good explanation about self-plagiarism that I could share with folks. Absolutely. All right, so just a couple more things. Mention really quickly, we use a lot of jargon in higher education, and we use a lot of terms that maybe students don't always understand. So I'd like to have a minute to let you just think, what are all of the different ways that an instructor might tell students that they need to provide citations? And I'm going to give a response that was shared to me by a participant who's here today, who's attended some of the previous workshops, who got an email from a student who had not provided citations and realized that the instructions that were given were to provide evidence, and realizing that not all students were going to automatically understand that evidence meant to provide citations. So that was one of those terms that, based on the experience that the instructor had in higher education, was completely natural to assume that evidence meant citations. But I just want to see if there are other thoughts or other ideas that you all might have about terms that might be used that may not be clear to students. Support your claims. Yes. Include bibliography, footnotes, works cited. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, just a few examples, just the basics like citation or cite, format, style, add counter arguments, primary literature. Yeah. Lots of those, right? Document, something, document what you've used, provide evidence, provide sources, provide citations, support your claims. Students may not recognize that all of those mean that we would like students to provide citations for their sources. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then I wanted to just highlight very quickly, we've already talked about this, sort of the emotional bottlenecks around plagiarism, the anxiety around it. And there's a few interesting studies that I've looked at. We know that a lot of our students are already experiencing high levels of stress or anxiety. And some studies have looked at whether students that are in that situation where they're already feeling a lot of stress and already feeling, depression or anxiety might be more likely to plagiarize. And, so this particular study found that, students that were already having those negative emotions that seemed to support, more likely indicators that student would be plagiarizing as well. So, just recognizing that there's a lot of reasons why our students might plagiarize that are not necessarily just around that they are, being lazy or that they're doing it on purpose because they just don't care. All right, so I'll pause there really quickly, and then the last part we'll go into some teaching strategies and resources. Yep, scholarly sources, Krista. Oh, that's a great point, right? Unintentional plagiarism, when something is phrased so elegantly and it sticks in the student's mind. Yes, right? That, this sounds so great. And they don't even remember that they heard it several years ago from someone else. This is something that I worry about a lot because I have all of these activities that I share. And I'm often like, I've been a librarian for a long time now. I have no idea where this came from. Did I attend a workshop, 5 years ago and someone did this activity and I thought it was really cool and it popped into my head 3 years later? I don't know. So, yeah. All right. So last part, some teaching strategies and activities. So I'm going to go through most of these fairly quickly, but a few things that I just wanted to mention. So this is the strategy, and we've already talked about this already, but really just taking a few minutes and questioning our own assumptions about what students understand and don't understand, and whether they have the same understanding of these issues that we do. Looking at our assignment instructions, are we always being as clear as we can about, what we expect from our students, and thinking about how our own background, how our own experience might be creating any type of hidden expectations that we have for students. So that's what I wanted to start with. And then as we've mentioned several times, making sure that we do clarify as best we can what our specific expectations are. We expect you to cite, class notes. I expect you to, do this kind of citation format. right? So that we are making our expectations really, really clear to students. And one of the things I have on here is thinking about this idea of sort of providing students some opportunities to use more functional citations in certain ways. And so what I mean by this is Claire Bollinger, who is I think she's in health sciences. She's an instructor here at Ohio State. She created these really quick, really great icons to really give students very clear understanding of what type of citation they are expected to give at particular times. So in some cases, maybe it's a more informal assignment. She allows them to just do the URL, the date access, and give that sort of basic information. In other cases, making it very clear that no, students do have to provide a full citation. There are also icons there for like, is collaboration accepted in this assignment or not? And these can be accessed through Canvas Commons. If folks go in and look at Citation Expectations by Claire Bollinger, Ohio State folks should be able to access those through Canvas Commons and can use those icons to make sure that you really are clarifying your expectations for students. So I wanted to share those really quickly and see some comments coming in. Icons and Carmen, yes. So if you access those through Canvas Commons, yeah, Louise, absolutely. Brad, should I have a plagiarism module on Carmen for my courses that contains videos, web pages, and handouts? Yes, absolutely, Brad. All right, a few other things. So thinking about activities that we could do for students. This is one that I've done with a couple classes of students, and it's always very fun, but it's also sometimes a little shocking, right? And it's basically, I allowed students to create a description of their fears or the frustrations or their anxieties around plagiarism. And they could be very creative. They could do a drawing, they could do a PowerPoint, you could write a song, whatever they wanted to do. And the responses were really intense, sometimes where students really made it clear how much they hated citations, they hated learning about it, how frustrated they were, how afraid they were. And basically what I've done with this, then I use this as a way to lead into a discussion and thinking about, first of all, it's okay if you have these emotional reactions around plagiarism. It's okay if you're afraid, that's a common and natural response that folks have. And then using that to lead into a discussion of, let's talk a little bit about why we think this is so important in higher education, why all of these rules and guidelines are necessary. As I said, I've done this a couple of times with students, and it was an assignment that I always really enjoyed, but it also, helped me to really get a handle on what students were thinking around these kinds of issues. Really quick, simple activity. If you're not sure about what your students do or do not understand about plagiarism, I love true false activities. I will just give students, here's 10 statements around plagiarism, here's 15 statements around plagiarism. You could do this, in a discussion board. You could do this with a Mentimeter poll, top hat poll. And, paraphrasing information is, plagiarism, yes or no. And that just gives you an understanding of sort of the general level of knowledge that your students have. And if there is something that you've been seeing a lot, maybe paraphrasing plagiarism has been a big problem in the past, you could have several questions around that so that, you have that time where you get that feedback from students about what they do or do not already know about plagiarism. So you can directly address some of the misconceptions that they might have. A collaborative definition building kind of activity, I think it'd be really helpful. You could use a Jamboard or some other tool like that. Have students write definitions of plagiarism, citation, self-plagiarism, and then have them compare those responses that they developed themselves to the definitions of plagiarism provided by COAM and discuss any differences between them, discuss why, something that maybe they didn't think was plagiarism is considered plagiarism by COAM. So that, again, they have that familiarity with the specific guidelines, but they've had an opportunity to think about their own understanding that can, again, give you a chance to directly address some of those misconceptions that they might have around plagiarism. Scenarios. I think that this can be a great way to think about, what is plagiarism, what is not plagiarism. COAM does have a plagiarism worksheet that has a few different scenarios that students can go through and look at. And this example is one, around self-plagiarism that is taken directly from the COAM worksheet. But you could use those examples. You could use in Carmen in a discussion post thread, or in-class activity as well. But just giving students a few scenarios and having talk through those scenarios and think about whether they represent plagiarism or not, I think could be a helpful activity. And this is sort of builds on that activity. This is one that I shared that I call perspectives on plagiarism. Basically, you have students think through a scenario, but then you go further and have them maybe think about 4 different roles. Cat moves the slides. Someone takes the role of the original author. Someone takes the role of the plagiarizer. Someone takes the role of the audience, and then maybe the broad sort of scholarly conversation. And talk about what it means from all of those different perspectives. I think Louis shared earlier, right, about how plagiarism, is disrespect to the original author. And this is a place where the students could really get that if someone is representing the perspective of that original author whose work has been misused or used by someone else without giving them credit. So having them see these different roles so that they recognize that it's not just an individual act, that plagiarism does have ripples throughout that broader conversation on that topic. So I'll pause there to see if there are any questions, comments, thoughts on any of those activities in terms of teaching plagiarism. And then the last part is just going to be a real quick overview of some resources that are available. So a few resources that I wanted to highlight. So I'll put this in the chat again. So the first link there should take you to a folder, and I'll check. I'll get to update those links before. That does have a COAM folder in there and has these resources from COAM. So they're like their basic definition of plagiarism, their plagiarism worksheet that has the scenarios, and then they have a longer worksheet that has instructor resources that really outlines sort of instructor responsibilities around plagiarism. And gives some guidance on how instructors can approach thinking about and teaching this. So those are all available to everyone. I want to mention on the university libraries, we have a site called Instructor Resources at University Libraries. I'm going to go out to that site really quickly. Hopefully this should follow everyone out there. Everyone should follow me out there. So Instructor Resources at University Libraries has a lot of different resources around teaching information literacy related topics. And so one of the pages on that site, if you go to Instructor Resources at University Libraries, ethical information use, you can see we pulled together a lot of readings around citation, plagiarism. We have a lot of videos that have been created by other universities on what plagiarism is, how to cite. And we picked these really specifically as ones that we thought were really good, that really represent it well, that were short, videos that wouldn't be too overwhelming for students, how to avoid it, and then some additional resources there. So all of that material is available to everyone to incorporate into your courses, and we have all of the licensing information there for those resources if folks want to use those. I also wanted to highlight that the University Libraries has a resource called Choosing and Using Sources, a Guide to Academic Research. And this is a free open access textbook that includes a lot of information on, just the research process in general. But you can see here that it does have sections on how to cite sources, copyright basics, fair use, ethical use of sources. And these are all really, short, quick overviews of these concepts that can be really easily linked in a Carmen course or shared, with the class, and anyone can access and read this book for free. So I wanted to make sure everyone is aware of that resource as well. All right, and then so that was that choosing and using. And then I just put a bunch of links on here for some of the resources that I found most helpful in thinking about citations. The North Carolina videos and why we cite and how we cite, I found were really helpful. So I'll just pause there as we have about 4 minutes left to see if there are any questions, comments, thoughts that folks would like to share. My references and resources are there, my image attributions. And everyone will get a follow-up email later this afternoon. That'll have, links to the recording, links to the slides, all of the materials and everything available. So we'll open it up for any final questions, comments, and thoughts that folks would like to share. Well, thank you, Maria. So thank you to those coming in. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Louise. Judy, great to see you. Sarah, Jared, thank you all so much. Great, Laurie, great, thank you. Rola, Tanya, great to have you all here today. So I will, Krista, hello. I will go ahead and stop recording, but I will stick around for a couple more minutes in case we do have questions, comments. Pat, wonderful, great, thank you.